Well, hey everybody, Dave Cross here. And on this video, I think I'm going to touch on a couple subjects. One is DNSTAP. If you recall, I think the last video on my NodeRed I uploaded was in regards to DNSTAP, monitoring and displaying the different screens, and the ability to effectively look at the queries, the IP addresses, and have different formats of reports that could be generated by connecting to this. This is also where I introduced the MongoDB for storage. And I started using this more and more through my different, more recent posts and videos through here. Now, I made a number of updates in this that I don't think I'll go through in terms of the code because I plan to upload this into a GitHub where you can download it, and I'll provide the link to do it. But a couple of things I did add that I thought were relatively important that helped me progress with my application and to help you kind of visualize and see things in data as well. One of those is I set up now a function within each of these different reports to determine whether or not is this an API call, meaning I want to use this as an API, or I want to use this as an HTML output. So I've created a flow variable, which right now I'm using as kind of just an individual flow, assuming just one or two clients. But as this grows, I'm going to have to extend this to create basically arrays of these and manage that. But I wanted to set for each of the reports whether or not the client input that they want this to be an API or not. So on the URL parameter list, when uploading this data, by specifying API equals 1, which is true, it's going to pass in saying that you wanted to return JSON for the data that was returned. So to kind of represent that, I can do API equals 1 here, and this should give me back all of the data less the HTML, because that's a separate process for formatting before. So this is what the original data looks like before it was formatted. And this then allows me to build on top of my applications, which I use VBNet, PowerShell, and others, to kind of build programs, but then use this workflow as the API interface to the data source. So I've got kind of a process that gives me interactive capabilities. I can use either a private Mongo distributed on a Pi or download on Linux. I can put it in a cloud if I want and have this data source utilized back and forth. So that's what I wanted to show you there, and I thought that was somewhat interesting. And in terms of the other reports here, let's see if I can find the second ones. We had the same here for the resource records. I did set those to the API enablement. So again, you can pull this through a counter, and this would give you a dashboard, and we might have something showing whether it's up or down, or some other links to it there. This one I already had in there, but a couple of things I added with the particular IP list in terms of the TAP IPs is in the default view, it was sorting everything by count. Remember, if you look back at the other video, it said, here are all the IPs, here are their counts, and so forth. That's great, but when I was trying to identify where my IP was and look for something individually, it was difficult. So I went back into the workflow, and as I was constructing and splitting the records and constructing the payload, I converted the IP address to its decimal integer, at least for IPv4, so that I could say now to IP sort by that integer value, which gives you a true sort of its IP. If you're not familiar, if you try to sort on IP addresses, you'll know that that doesn't work well in a string comparison. So it gives you a true sort, and in that true sort, it then would allow you to change that default. And as I saw here in the tab, I added a question format. And so now I added a third report that allowed us then to say, show me the top questions. And these are the top things that all the clients are querying in this particular lab environment. And because everybody always wants that, here's the top 20. And I thought this is great because now I can go in and set my dashboard to give you a drop down of what's your top choice, 5, 10, 20, and tell it to do API. And I can then interact with this through my API programs and pull this back into this counter. So that was my goal. That was the whole point of the whole thing here. So that's basically the updates I had, and I just wanted to show you that. And then I got into the DHCP, and I figured, well, I've already got the DNS. I already show that I can upload this in frequency. My server is barely ever being touched. It's only got a couple CPUs, but for the lab environment, for what I'm doing here, it's pretty short in terms of resource requirements. And I'm able to kind of, go in and proactively do this over time without impacting production. So, make sure you have a lab. But over time, what I want to do with this, I thought, well, I can do trending analysis because I'm taking a 5-minute snapshot. I might be able to provide reports back that will show whether the trending is up or down or a time range. So I'm thinking here within the dashboard, I'll have different time sliders that can show you back in history the different leases. I also noticed that in my DHCP server, I cut over from my router into my private, and I didn't really kind of do any kind of migration because I just don't care anymore at this point for my small lab. I just wanted to go out and get some leases formatted so I can pull it in and start seeing the reports, right? So, in a production, I would have concern with that. Don't get me wrong. But here, I wanted just quickly to go through. I also found that there were, leases that had no names. So I went ahead and I put in a couple of client classes in my server to tell it to generate a new name, which I'm supplying in the list. And I further tied it back into my get MAC API, which I also had the NodeRed for, to go out and query the MAC. So, through the SQLite, which again, I think I'll bundle together with, MongoDB and using that function as a requirement. So I had quite a bit there, and of course, then pulling in the MAC address and to look at that. So that was my weekend, and it was interesting, and it gave me some good insight into some of the data. And so let me show you just a couple of quick things about the workflow in NodeRed. And I do promise I'm getting to the point where I've set up my GitHub, and I'm trying to figure out a way to get all this out there and downloadable so that you can kind of follow this with me. But anyway, in the leases, I have it set up to do a post upload. I'm then telling it to read that and convert it to a string, because I know this is all string, into a call out text. I'm setting that message payload, which is what's used to pass to the next node, that the call out text is the payload. I'm checking the file name only because my other server did, where I copied this from. But I also wanted to start tracking the DHCP IP. So each time I upload this from a server, I'm capturing the IP that it's originating from. And I'll have this in part of basically a shell window that you'll be able to select a server from a dropdown through this dashboard and get this type of result instantaneously. So what I'm doing with that is in the message, when I connect through the HTTP in Node, under the message rec socket underscore peer name is the IP address of the client or proxy. Now be careful with this. If you're using a proxy server, this might be the proxy IP. Different results may vary in your environment. So I also wanted to know, because in the display, when I was looking at this, I just saw some counters and I'm guessing, when's it going to push? When am I going to see an update? So I went ahead and set some global variables to set up a next push and last push, which I can also use if I'm trying to do some type of date calculation or a simulation here. I can, for trending, I can do that as well. Just setting these here and just going to go through the push, and then those are the global variables and how to set that. By the way, you do set the name of the variable, and then you would do, pushing that to that. And also know that in NodeRed, your global set can also be JavaScript functionality, so you can do that as well. Now, everything coming in is a string, so I'm then converting it to JSON. And the reason I'm converting it to JSON is so I can convert it to an object and, or actually parse that incoming JSON to an object that I can start looking at the properties. Okay, so when that is converted, we're then going to put a change node in between the JSON and where I'm going to get the URL. So in this, I'm actually moving the payload into its to original property. Because if I ever want to reference it, as I've made kind of reference past, you want to leave the payload intact as much as possible because other, down the road you might need it, or other applications might need to use that. Same thing with the set. So I'm then setting the payload to the active leases. So in that original payload, there's an active leases object that has that JSON structure that I look for the lease. So this information stored in that active lease structure. Also in there is the subnets JSON structure. So I'm copying that into a new property called message subnets. Same for shared networks and same for the summary. And actually, I see original shared networks. This actually should be summary. So let's change that there. I don't think I'm doing anything with that anyway. So with that then, I'm passing that into the set URL. And what I'm basically doing here is I'm getting the IP and I'm splitting it. And the reason I'm doing this is I found I wanted to sort, like I showed you on the IP sort, in a true sort. So this function in JavaScript is how you convert this by ANDing basically the different octets and multiplying by 256. So the start attr int then I'm putting into a variable that is called IPInt, and I'm storing that in the object here in message. It's being passed into the next node where I then tell it to go out and get the MAC address. This calls my get MAC node, so this would be required, or some way to translate the MAC. From there, on the output of this, I expect that there's going to be a payload. And the payload is either one element, which is always 0, and I expect that if I'm passing a MAC address. If I'm passing a vendor, I might get multiples, so you'll have an array response. So here I'm doing payload. So I'm now going to move that into the payload, which effectively takes the variables that are stored here, which are the IP, MAC, and IPInt, into that payload. So if you kind of see where we're setting the additional values here. And then there I'm going to join this all back together. So now I join everything in the payload back to an array. I'm then going to set a couple of global changes that are going to construct us on what to do next. And that, then I'm going to move the payload to the active leases. And then I'm going to delete the payload, and then I'm going to reset it because I'm going to copy some new variables back into those payloads based on their original values. Then I'm going to put the date, which is new. I want to copy the DHCP IP, which is new. And then I'm going to put the summary. So here, this would be the detail that would be within the summary for that update I just made the change. We'll see it. And then lastly, I want to kind of delete these originals because I no longer need them. And I just didn't want to confuse anymore in the chain of command. And so in the payload, because I specified in the Mongo, I only want to do save and I only want to store the payload. It only takes what's stored in the payload. Everything else gets discarded. And that's it. So everything gets uploaded in a 5-minute interval. It processes this detail, and then it saves it into a snapshot, which is stored on my server, which I can then look at and looks like this. So it's objects, it's shared networks, leases, and so on. And this is how that information looks in that database. Okay. And then in the show leases, which is our URL effectively that I'm doing this here, I'm setting the query initially when I log in, and I'm basically saying, give me no filter sort. I'm not sorting on any particular column or date or anything. But what I am saying is give me the very last object in a descending sort of all the objects. Give me the last one, which is -1. And then I want a message limit of 1, so effectively 1. Now, as I think about this, pardon me, I kind of want to look at the trending, and I may introduce this where you'll say how many snapshots, or I might aggregate the data or summarize it in some way. So I might say that I want 2 or 3, just to show you some type of visual indicator, whether the trend is up, down, or same, some type of HTML representation. And the last part here is I go ahead and I set the flow variable API to true or false based on whether or not you're expecting an API or you want to return the HTML. And lastly, setting message payload to query, which is effectively an empty payload, but with the sort and limit, which will do the work. That then gets passed into the Mongo node with the find for the leases collection. And what I expect then is that I'm going to have at least some type of data, and that it's not an empty array. So in this payload, if it's empty, I want to go ahead and end this session and go ahead and tell it no response. If it's not empty, is not empty, I want to change a couple of rules again. And these, I want to go ahead and copy some things around that are going to help me manage the data. And what I expect from here is I expect at least payload 0 to be the information I'm looking for. So in this, because there's only one record, so payload 0, I'm going to copy the data from the database. And this is then going to copy these back into their variables. So setting these variables to their payload 0 variable equivalent. Right. So just pulling these all back in. And then lastly, the global variables, which I set here, with the last options. This then splits this array, which is, however many in terms of the leases or so on. And we're going to then set up the change nodes again so that we can query the IP address based on the input. So I'm hard coding this to my one server, but I would set this up by variable or, some other value. But effectively what I'm doing again is moving some values. So the payload OUI to OUI and back into vendor and others. I'm then going to set the headers. Now I do have a login service, which I think some of my node processes go through, and I'm using those for a read-only user to pull this data to get searches. So you'll maybe need to look back at that, or if you have any questions about that, let me know. But I set these as a global value that I just pull back into the system when I need it and tell the system to log in every 30 minutes to update the token. And here is the URL that I'm going to pass to the next node, telling it through the JSON or expression builder what IP address it is that I'm looking to sort, and this is that format. And this is what I'm trying to find in terms of the IP address. And then lastly, I want to reject any unauthorized in case it tries to complain about the self-signed certificate. Now this thing is called into the get device by IP adder. So I have a HTTP request node that I'm passing it the URL, and I'm telling it to use a TLS for SSL. This, in its response, should give me at least an IP address. If it does, I'm going to have the fault, whether it's null or not null. If it's null, I effectively want to change some of the values for the IP, the MAC, and the vendor, and copy those back into the payload because the get was the payload I expected. I expected the get IP address to return a payload where these would be set. Because it did not, I'm removing the fault and I'm setting those manually based on the lease values that were pulled in. Then I want to pass, and I'm generating the IP integer based on the IP being sent and setting that IP in. And I could probably do this in another expression builder, but I did it through a separate function to keep it consistent. And then lastly, joining this back together. And then because I really just want to sort all of these by IP, I'm sorting it. The last function is whether or not I'm using an API and it's checking that to be true or false. And if it's true, then it goes ahead and it just outputs everything directly to the client, as you can see here. If not, it runs it through the CSS node and the HTML node. And in the HTML node, we're then going to process through the various different tables, which are going to be the summary, where we pull out the information. We're then going to pull in the payload data, which is the actual IP address and MAC and so forth. And then down to the subnets, etc., that we're going to pull in for the summary. And if it does have an IP address, there may be some multi-homed interfaces. And if we need to pull the MAC address and IP, I then go through and process the array of interfaces, if they're greater than 0, for the interface for the IP and the MAC, and then set in the payload the vendor OUI and MAC based on those stored values. So just pulling it back into the payload, this specific information, and combining it with the get information that was provided. And then we're going to delete these particular variables or properties from the message. Because effectively we're going to rejoin it, everything goes back through that same loop and checks the API. And then in the output result, here's kind of what we have. Now again, because of the frequency and the timing on this and how this might work with 10, 20, 50,000 IP addresses, I don't know. I'm going to have to go through, and I've got client simulators to do this, so I'll tell you eventually. And I'll have to find out what the maximum is, but I assume there's going to be some maximum size lease file or upload file that we can take. And I came in some of the other tests I had run, I found that it was around 2 gigabytes, I think is the memory limitation. I couldn't figure out how to get past that. Maybe I will. But anyway, this is what I had, and this is what I had in that report. And then starting to bring all of this back together and the ability to query the IP address, query all of the DNS records of that IP, and to be able to filter and sort in time and do other things with it. I thought was kind of cool. And as I kind of build this into, again, my Raspberry Pi, which this project is for, ultimately I want to do something in the enterprise with it. But in this project I have, this is just a single interface, and it'll be a series of dashboards and sliders that you can kind of touch and control or do through a phone or a remote and see, online what your status of your home network is, and to use it as your DNS and DHCP and other functions. Kind of give you some more privacy. You can also set up response policy zones, things like that for, blocking out certain domains and others and so forth. So that's just one of the other projects. And maybe when I get there, it's been a year or two in the making, I might get there, time permitting. But if you see anything that you need help on, or that you wanted more information on, let me know. I'm going to have the GitHub, like I said, in the next, probably a couple weeks. I need to take some time off, maybe spend some, time on it, but that's going to be off in the distance. When I'm done, I'll put the links out there and make an update so you can see and download these and make sure that it works with, a Linux NodeRed that you have. And where applicable, where you can actually use the cloud automation. And let me know if you need any work, assistance with it, and we can, get you a evaluation or something with IP control. So anyway, take care. Thanks for joining me. That was a lot of talk there. And again, let me know if you have any questions, and I'll follow up with anything new that I come up with in this final project, as I say, and with GitHub. Take care. Bye.